Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson, and joining me today, oh, this one is special. This is Eric Czuleger. Welcome to the studio, Eric.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for making the time for us. Y'all, listen to this resume, all right? He is a geopolitical analyst, investigative journalist, and founder of Under Report, a multi platform geopolitics brand. He's a trained intelligence analyst under George Friedman at Geopolitical Futures and holds graduate degrees from the Rand School of Public Policy and the University of Oxford. He's the author of You Are Not Here Travels Through Countries That Don't Exist, drawing on reporting from more than 45 countries. I found you on TikTok, drawn to you, by you had a fantastic analytical video. But when I went down the rabbit hole of just, researching you, you cover underreported stories in places that are not officially recognized. A sort of statelessness, a no man's land, if you will. Can you talk about how you got into this world travel, this 45 countries?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. And also, I've been admiring your work on TikTok for some time now too. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer from 2011 to 2013, and back in my day, the Peace Corps just kind of threw a dart at a map and said, "Hey, you're going to go spend 27 months living and working in that country," and that map just or that dart just so happened to hit Albania for me, a country that I still call home more often than not. And I spent a good deal of time living in a small border town near Kosovo. So it's on the border of Albania and Kosovo, very small Muslim town. And it's Peace Corps, so the circumstances aren't exactly New York City. So it's a really really tiny little village that I really ended up falling in love with in a certain respect, and noticing how much as a child, like I'm a millennial, but as a child and a teen of the global war on terror, you hear so much about Islam and what it is and what it means in the world, and then you spend 2 years living in a small Islamic village and you realize that it's not that thing at all. And maybe these are not the robots that we were looking for in terms of the actors who are meaning Americans harm. And at the same time, I was there on near Kosovo for it was the 5 year anniversary of Kosovo, and it was the 100 year anniversary of Albania. And that's a really sort of impactful and interesting thing to witness. Around the same time period, South Sudan had separated from Sudan while I was in college previously. South Ossetia sort of separated from, or was forcibly separated from, the Republic of Georgia. I suppose I just started noticing that even though the United States felt like this monolithic and evanescent thing, that really the concept of statecraft was a little bit more flexible and potentially something that we should examine, because we all think that our countries are these immovable shapes that have always been and will always be. But the reality of the is that countries come into existence and then they decay and they break apart into other countries, and part of that is, I think, so wonderful. Like, I think the how I end up thinking about my own country really so largely depends on the type of day that I'm having. Like, if I'm having a good day, like it's this magnificent invisible architecture of narrative that allows me to plug my own individual identity into something like well greater than myself, and it makes me responsible for the people who come after me, and it connects me to the successes and atrocities committed by other people who are also calling themselves Americans. And then, like, on a bad day, it's just a subscription service that like bombs people for me for the low price of a third of my income. Like what? And I was accidentally born into it. Um, and so I noticed, how motivating statecraft was for people, that the Kosvar flag could really drive people to tears, or it could drive people into fits of rage, depending upon like what that person believes about that place. And I just, for a while after Peace Corps, I was thinking, like, I had this sort of book in the back of my mind. And whatever your audience has in the back of their mind is something that they've always wanted to do. Like, just start doing it, because it's definitely worth it. And I was like, it would be really interesting to spend a year just living in unrecognized countries, like to spend an entire year just in, like, literally not on any map, because those countries don't exist on any map. um, and after my training as an intelligence analyst, they liquidated a lot of the company, and so I had a head full of knowledge about terrorism, and specifically I was looking at the Islamic State and the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, and sort of faced with that moment that I think a lot of people get into at some period, where they're just like, well, if I could do anything in the world, like, what would I do? And I started thinking about that book again, like, well, what would I like if I could live in unrecognized countries? Like, what would I do? And I'd already been researching the Kurdish referendum on independence so much, and I was like, I think I'd really like to go to Kurdistan and see a new country get made, because wow, like, what a time in history to be there if it happens, and what a time in history to be there if it doesn't. So I just got a job teaching English in Iraqi Kurdistan, and a couple weeks later, I was living in Erbil, and I had begun the journey of the book, which turned out to be a lot stranger than I had bargained for.
Yeah. So you cover 45 countries? Is that all in this span of time, or is this like
Oh
over
no.
decades, or like, okay.
No, 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 no. I've lived and worked in, I think, I don't know what the number is, but lived, worked, traveled, gone through about between 45 and 47 countries, maybe more now, I don't know.
Hmm.
But that's the number that I trot out on resumes. No, specifically in the book, I covered only 5 unrecognized countries. So I covered Iraqi Kurdistan, and I was there during the referendum on independence in 2016. And so what was happening in Iraqi Kurdistan at the time was basically, um, the Islamic State was sort of on its back foot. It was on its way out the door. Success was fairly inevitable. A coalition of over 60 countries came together to fight the Islamic State. And as a part of that, the Kurds who were living in northern Iraq were doing a good deal of the heavy lifting in that fight. This not only brought the Kurds into public attention, but it also extended an enormous amount of goodwill from larger countries. It also, and it's not to be ignored, it also armed them. One of the difficulties that the United States has had with the Kurds traditionally is the fact that the US really enjoys using them as a proxy, but has to navigate this difficult relationship with them, where they want to arm them well enough to fight on behalf of the United States, but they don't want to arm them well enough to fight for their own country. And there is quite a bit of goodwill towards the United States in Iraqi Kurdistan specifically. But from an analytical point of view, it's very difficult to see a future where there is an independent Kurdish state. And so going into the referendum, anyway, they decide, hey, we're going to have a vote, and we're going to vote ourselves free of Baghdad. And so they vote. 92% says, hey, we want to have our own independent Kurdistan for the first time. This is not including the other Kurdish regions in Syria or Iran or Turkey. However, it's just the Iraqi Kurdistan area. But as it turns out, Baghdad is really the only country, or the only actor that has a vote, because of course they're able to leverage more violent force against the Kurds, and the Kurds did, in a certain way, overplay the hand that they were attempting to play, which was they wanted to take the region of Kirkuk with them, which is a large oil producing region, traditionally Kurdish. But then during the reign of Saddam Hussein, it was Arabized, which is, a weirdly fancy term for just saying we kicked Kurds out and moved Arabs in. So to understand like the history of the region and the story that's connected to this region was pretty daunting for somebody from far away, but understanding it from the ground level, that to me is kind of the critical bit. And so after Kurdistan, I went to Kosovo, because I was actually going to stay in Kurdistan, but I was unable to return. Baghdad basically shut down the airspace over Kurdistan, and I had a girlfriend at the time who was living in Bulgaria as a Fulbright scholar. I had wanted to see her for Christmas, so I left the country, but I left it over land. And when I tried to come back in, I was accused of being a Kurdish operative in some respect, and both she and I, unfortunately, we're still very good friends today, and she's the producer of my podcast. Shout out to Savannah. I'm glad that I didn't get us both imprisoned in Turkey, but I did get us both kicked out of Turkey. So we were told to walk back to Bulgaria at like 2:00 in the morning. And off we went. And I thought my book was kind of over at that point, because, I was going to write it about stateless countries, and I thought Kurdistan was a really great place to do it. And then I realized, well, there are other stateless countries. So I went back to Kosovo, and I saw their 10-year anniversary. And I realized I could also go to a place called Transnistria. Transnistria is this sort of little sliver of land between Ukraine and Moldova. And it's a really strange area. It's sort of like the USSR never left there. So they still have the KGB. You still have functioning communist-style farms. And this is right on the Dniester River, hence Transnistria, a Russian enclave protected by the Russian army as well. And interestingly enough, I was there during the time of the Russian elections for Vladimir Putin. And of course, that's like this really strange gray area of statecraft, because Russia was having Russian elections, in a place that is, from the international community, it's recognized as Moldova. But from the Russian community, it's recognized as a sort of state building project of Russia. And Transnistria is recognized only by other state building projects of Russia. So it's recognized by Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Just to clarify, so Transnistria is Moldova?
Depends on who you ask.
Right, right, but
Yeah.
that's okay, okay.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
like,
But okay, so if you're to
no
look at the
way.
map, basically you'll see this sort of dotted line, and the capital the capital of Transnistria is a place called Tiraspol. Interesting area, though. I mean, it was the Russians were originally moved there by Catherine the Great, who was sort of seen as a good geographic area to take over because of access to the Black Sea from the Dniester River, well known for wine and especially cognac. And then, of course, you also see some like I love stateless countries, and I love places that are just kind of hard to get to, because I think that like the places that are hard to get to, whoever you meet there had to want to get there.
Yeah,
They
right,
didn't,
yeah.
right? Anybody can accidentally end up in the Denver airport. It's really hard to end up accidentally in Tiraspol, Transnistria. And you just find these sort of cultural moments that have washed up there as well. Like there's a renowned cognac factory there, and we were sort of touring this cognac factory, and this guy's like, well, do you want to see our baseball museum? And I was like, why is there a baseball museum? in a cognac factory in Transnistria. He's like, well, we love baseball here because the Cubans during communism came and taught us how to play baseball. And it's like the most American thing, but like you came to it from the least American way of
Right.
doing it. And to this point, like there are actually professional baseball players playing on American teams who are from Transnistria, um, which is so astounding. And then from there, I went to this place called Liberland, which is the world's first cryptocurrency based nation. It's
Oh,
on an empty island between Croatia and Serbia.
okay.
Yeah, it was just a so Liberland got created because there was an island that was sort of declared Tierra Nulla, so it's like no man's land at the fall of Yugoslavia. And around, I can't remember the exact year, but anyway, Bitcoin starts going crazy, and a lot of the political philosophy that underlies Bitcoin too isn't just tech nerds getting rich off of nerd dollars. There's a political philosophy around it that basically says, okay, well, what happens if we disintermediate finance from a central authority? And part of what falls out from that is looking at how do you create this sort of like anarcho-libertarian version of statecraft. And then that Liberland was born. They were like, look, there's this island that nobody claims, and specifically nobody claims it because that was a part of the treaty that ended Yugoslavia. So like, why don't we just take our Bitcoin and go take it over? And that's what they did. And I met them at their 3-year anniversary, which is also a crypto conference. I kind of assumed it was like going to be some Burning Man thing, but instead it was like, I was just hanging out in the lobby of this like crypto conference that was also the 30-year anniversary of Liberland, and I'm like, trying to find an official to talk to, and I'm pointing to this really regal English Pakistani man, and I was like, I hear you're the Secretary of State. He's like, yeah, and he's like, I'm also the personal lieutenant to the Queen of England, and I'm a doctor, and I'm like, gee, what? This is wild. I'm like, what are we doing here? He's like, well, we're making a country. What do you think we're doing? And I was like, well, this is bizarre and fascinating. And there's a much longer story here that people have to read the book to hear, but it's fairly goofy. And per as I was doing this, I met all the Liberland folks and the foreign secretary, who's a guy named Tom, who works for Expedia, and I think he lives in Florida. I don't know. He's just a guy. Um, he was like, where's the last stop on your stateless country tour? And I was like, well, I'm going to Somaliland. And he said, well, we have an embassy there. And I was like, that's really strange. And I'm
There's a
hard
crypto
to
embassy between Liberland and Somaliland.
yeah, absolutely. And I set it up. They asked me to be their ambassador. so so when I say former ambassador in my bio, like it's kind of joking, but it's also kind of not. Like I was the Liberland ambassador to Somaliland, and I set up their embassy in Hargeisa, Somaliland, which was a really strange set of things to do.
Hmm.
Because I mean, I was really just a sort of like dirtbag backpacker journalist at that time. I was like waiting. I was waiting to hear back from Liberland while I was like sleeping in my girlfriend's place in Bulgaria, and I just hadn't heard back from them. I knew I could stay at their mansion in their embassy in Hargeisa. But I hadn't heard back from them, and I was like, well, this is a problem, because it is kind of a problem to like have a ticket to go to northern Somalia or Somaliland and have no idea like where to go or what to do. And so I just bothered the president of Liberland a lot more, and eventually he was like, here's the problem, like we lost our ambassador, so like I don't know, like would you want to do that? And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, do you want to be the ambassador from Liberland to Somaliland? And I was like, I mean, yeah, if I can stay in the like, is there like a couch I could sleep on? Um, and he's like, well, you have to do some stuff for us. And I'm like, yeah, sure. What do I have to do? He's like, well, buy furniture for the embassy because we don't have any. Like, there's just a bed in there. I'm like, yeah, that's fine. Sure. I've never bought furniture for myself before, but I'm sure I can figure out how to buy furniture in Somalia. And then he's like, well, you also have to make diplomatic connections with the government of Somaliland. I'm like, sure, sounds good. I can go meet the vice president of Somaliland. So I just had those two things to do. And eventually, there's a third thing that became necessary, because about 2 weeks into my time in Somaliland, and this isn't really spoiling the book, it becomes more dramatic there, but a cyclone blew through Somaliland, and it was called Cyclone Sagar. And eventually communications were restored, and I got a call from the Secretary of State, and he said, oh, this actually works out really well for us. And I'm like, I don't see how this cyclone worked out well for us. And he's like, well, like it was, I'm fine, but like, I wasn't like, yeah, this cyclone made my day. He's like, well, we are the only ones with an aid team on the ground because we're the only ones who recognized Somaliland. And I was like, that's great. Who's the team? And he's like, it's you. And I was like, oh no, I I really thought it wasn't gonna be. I thought there was other people here. And he's like, yeah, just go figure out how to give diplomatic aid to help these nomads in Somaliland. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll figure that out. And I and I feel like what ends up happening, again, I'm not spoiling much. I think if people read the book, they'll get a lot more details. But I felt really two ways about what we ended up doing, because I ended up coordinating the delivery of around 7 tons of food to some nomads who were deeply affected by the cyclone. And like, I feel great about that. I'm really glad that I was able to do that. Frankly, I didn't think I could, and if it wasn't for the wonderful human beings that I was working with on the ground in Somaliland, it simply would have been impossible. Them working on transport and keeping me safe and all of that stuff. But I think the thing that was left me with a bit of a moral nosebleed about it was the fact that we brought all of this food out there into the middle of the Somali desert, and then we brought me out there with my government contacts, and I found out partway through, the journey is like 8 hours and no roads, and da, 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 that the food had already been out there, and I was like, well, these people are starving. Like, they can just, like, they have the food, right? Like, it's all good. And they're like, no, like, we need to wait for you to give them the food. Like, this is, you're an ambassador. Like, this is a photo opportunity. And I was like, ah, right. This is not real. I mean, quote unquote real aid work, but like, this is not just pure aid work. This is about gaining and maintaining political power. And on the one hand, I'm really happy that we were able to bring out all of that food. On the other hand, I felt pretty, I had some difficult feelings about how this was essentially like a direct soft power move, and one that is on behalf of a cryptocurrency based nation to the aid of one of the poorest places in the world. So yeah, I mean, largely how I feel about like that part of the journey and that book, again, kind of depends on the type of day that I'm having. Like, some days I'm really, really proud that happened, and then sometimes I'm like, man, I was a political tool for Bitcoin.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, and I don't know if you can do anything with states, either. Like, at some point, like, it's just like we're all just human. Like, we're all just part of the systems that we're a part of. Like,
Yeah,
I've like
I mean,
recognized.
I think that's like a really good and kind of like healthy way to look at it, because it's just like, I think one of the best things that I've learned is as like an analyst and now a bit more of a scholar of national security is just like just looking at the constraints that everybody is under, the constraints of our birth and the imperatives of our birth, the constraints and imperatives, not just physical ones, but mental and even spiritual ones. Um, I was recently in northern Iraq. I was in a place called Lalish, which is the mecca for Yazidis, who are a much maligned group by the Islamic State. And but it's a gorgeous spiritual structure, and Lalish was an incredible place. I felt really touched to experience it. Um, but I was speaking with one of the Yazidis there, and she was like, "Yeah, well, our structure, like the structure of our community, is like it's basically like three types of people, and we believe that these are the three types of people that everybody, like it's almost like a caste system, and you have to marry within your type of person." And I think that the difficulty that we experience oftentimes as Americans is it's really hard for us to understand the constraint of living growing up in another country, or in another culture, or in another economy. We're told from a very early age that like you can do and be anything, and to a large extent that is very true. But that's not the same thing that every other culture is taught. And it's one of the things that makes our culture much less interoperable with other cultures. Like time and time again, the United States has been seemingly baffled that the Middle East doesn't want Starbucks on every corner, and air conditioned movie theaters and shopping malls that we seem to like continually offer them if only they'll elect a Jeffersonian democratically elected government,
Right.
that we agree with. Like ours, like putting ourselves at this sort of like hierarchy, intellectual hierarchy, as the best leads to so much violence and chaos, and I think it's just a failure of cultural imagination.
Well, I'm really grateful that you brought this up because one of the things that you've studied and you talk about on your platform, or at least I'm curious to learn more, is how religion plays out in conflict, and really specifically, uh, how does it impact strategy and national security? Does it impact decision making? How have you seen religion play out in some of these conflicts abroad?
I feel like I've seen one of the things that I'm interested in as far as looking at how religion impacts conflict is that it is oftentimes the most visible, but least impactful component, depending on how it's used, right? Uh, I think looking having grown up in America and spent a good deal of time in the Middle East, there is a sort of a valence on the Middle East, or well, one that it is a monolith, that Islam
Right,
is
right.
this one huge monolithic thing, and that's just simply not the case. When I was living in Erbil, I think just due to how many different cultures live on my damn block. Like I think I
Mm-hmm.
said hello to people in like five different languages, and that's not because I speak five different languages. I certainly don't. It's just because I would learn hello and what's up and like the five different cultures that were around me. So it's like I would probably like say hello in Kurdish, Hindi, Arabic, English, and French. Like, oh no, and Assyrian. Chaldean, sometimes they call it. So like all of those existed on my block, like on just me walking to like go get some groceries. So one is this sort of failure of imagination to sort of paint all of these people as Muslim, and because of that, having a certain amount of intellectual deficiencies, that their mapping of reality is ultimately guided by this sort of Stone Age or I guess Bronze Age philosophy, and that's why there's all of these troubles in the world, and I just don't think that that's fundamentally true. I think it's the easiest thing for people to believe, especially in the West, because it allows us, one, to treat an entire section of the world as the other, as the negation of our culture, and because they're the negation of our culture, they create sort of cultural boundaries that allow us to know that we're us and they're them, and so that has some sort of functionality to it. But I think really the best way for me to conceptualize how religion works, how religion, ethnicity, identity, all of these things that are like very, very apparent to everybody, um, because they're so visible, and they're easy to pin things on. I think the best way to look at them is as networks. So they're almost nodes in a network, right? And certain networks have higher throughput. And so, what are they putting through these networks? Well, you can look at political power as a way of utilizing violent force. So violence is one of the things that can be put through a network. Another one is money. Another one is attention. All of these things, when brought together, they're easier for them to flow within networks that have a similar language, a similar story, a similar way of communicating with one another, communicating value to one another. It's there. There's quite literally a halal banking system. There are specifically like Jewish and Christian systems of transferring wealth, either internationally or domestically. There are networks of communication. We even see this with the Christian right in the United States. I was born and raised Catholic, and coming into contact with some of the ideas of, I guess, the maybe non-denominational, or what I would call like the born again Christian community, I was like, I've never heard any of these ideas before. Like, I've just never heard them. I read the same Bible, and I was raised with maybe similar traditions, but my phone is complaining. So I was raised with similar traditions, uh, but I've never seen those things before. And that's because they're in a different network. I've never been inside a mega church before and like gone to like a very good friend of mine. He was sort of raised in the mega church
Mm-hmm.
vibe, and he was talking about like how he was played in the band, and he's like, I was the drummer at big church. And I was like, what's big church? He's like, well, if you grew up non-denominational Christian, you would know what big church was. Like, big church is like the sort of rock and roll version of Christianity. And I was like, this is almost unintelligible for me. It's a different culture. But that's just because it was out of my network. And the United States has leveraged these networks to great effect. Look at using the Kurds in order to fight against the Islamic State. Essentially, one network was detached from the American system via taking out Saddam Hussein. And then the Ba'athist Party ended up becoming the foundation for the Islamic State. And at the point that it was detached from the American network, well, then now we have to figure out a way to extinguish these ideas and make sure that ours prevail.
Hmm. Well, and you're talking about religion driving some of these things, and also not how you just brought up American evangelical networks, and how much these have worked very hard to get involved with even like Israel, and here we are in Iran, and we still don't have a clear answer from the Pentagon, from the White House, from anybody, why our tax dollars aren't doing what they're doing. So, can you kind of talk about how religion plays a role in right now and geopolitics, and because it seems very strange, like you said, these ideas that I haven't
Well,
heard from either. I was raised Christian too. I was like, where are these coming from?
yeah, well, I mean, and it's so from my understanding, and I'm in no way, I'm in no way a scholar of religion, but I think that the best read on the study of history and the study of geopolitics, like if you're the best read on the study of history for me is like that this is the study of change, and the best read on the study of geopolitics to me is really about like how power maps onto the globe, and how power moves. I think one way of thinking about how power travels along the world is it can be pooled in certain places, and it can be it's almost like water in a certain way. It can be pooled, it can be channeled, it can be concentrated, and it can be networked. And I think some of the concerning bits that I've seen recently in terms of the, I guess, US political and spiritual imagination is one, this idea that US soldiers have been told that there is an oncoming holy war, or that this is a holy war. Obviously, we've seen a good deal of Secretary Hegseth equating the current military actions in Iran to religious moments. Specifically, I'm thinking of the fact that when this pilot was rescued, in a totally real, absolutely definitely happened story, the first thing that the pilot sent back to his to the base that was going to that was going to uh sorry the first thing that he sends back to the base that's going to go and rescue him is God is good. Pete Hegseth goes on this story about how he crashed, and then he on Good Friday, and then he hung out in a cave, and then he rose again when he was rescued on Easter Sunday. Now, first of all, this is just a really ham-fisted story, and it is silly, but like the thing is, I think that we need to be very, very careful with silly ideas, because just because something's silly doesn't mean it's not super important. And I think that this is a super important moment, because what it indicates is that this, if that message rung as hollow or strange to you, then that message wasn't for you. That message was to the Christian holy warrior base, the dispensationalists who see this as a completely reasonable fight to get into, because what it does is it hastens the arrival of the Messiah, or the re-arrival of the Messiah. And the really pernicious thing that I think is very dangerous is the fact that this does map closely with some of the Jewish theology, or at least some portion of the Jewish religious community that is looking for the return of the Messiah, specifically after the temple is built again. Now, that in Jewish philosophy, from what I understand, and I'm not Jewish, but there is the thought that the Temple of Jerusalem, the third Temple of Jerusalem, has already been built. It's a spiritual temple, and it's been built, within the Jewish community itself. And then, of course, there's also the idea that they know it actually must be rebuilt physically. Now, if it's rebuilt physically, it's entirely possible that this, ends up happening at the expense of holy spaces for both Christians and Muslims in Jerusalem. Obviously, well, perhaps not obviously, but like, I don't believe in any of the metaphysical parts of this. I simply don't. I don't think that there is a Messiah on the way back. But what I think doesn't matter. What matters is the people who have that capacity to do violent force, the people who are at the switchboard of the network. They believe it, and they're attempting right now, quite clearly, to leverage the authority of various holy books to motivate their networks to potentially use violent force, to potentially drive financing and attention to a crusade, and that will be at the expense of a great deal of innocent lives and people who simply don't believe the same things that they do.
Yeah. It's so I posted about this a few weeks ago. Like anybody who does identify as faithful to any of these Abrahamic faiths, like should feel really upset by how much it's been exploited. Like these very wealthy, powerful people who, by the way, have showed us again and again and again that they are above the law. Like that rules are for us and but not for them, and like that almost behave as if they are gods, turning around and using religious language to stoke, like you said, some sort of attention, support, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's I can get almost like it should be offensive for
I was gonna say, like I am not I'm not religious. I'm fascinated by religion, but as somebody once said, that was way cooler than me. Faith is a gift that has not yet been bestowed upon me. So I love the concepts around it. I interact with global faiths consistently, um, but looking at it as an outsider, I think that if if I'm claiming that holy book, whatever it is, and I'm watching somebody take something that I feel is not only bringing me but the world a great deal of peace and community, and they're using that as a cudgel to not only run in the absolute opposite direction and make as much war and violence as humanly possible, but also to fracture society. Yeah, I would be so deeply offended. It's the antithesis of what I know the faithful to be.
and you've seen so much abroad, and whether it's like kind of like these stateless unrecognized territories, but you've also been in parts that have seen a lot of conflict. What does it look like over time? How does the military and religion and people and even stability, how does religious or theocratic government and military, what does it look like in your experience
I
to
think
go all in? Or have you seen that? Have you seen religious militias?
no. I think that they end up becoming more, more cultural. I find that the expression of religion that I run into more often than not is a lot more quiet, a lot more contemplative, and uh, a lot more common. I think about the fact, while I was the ambassador to Liberland, from Liberland to Somaliland, I had my mansion, and outside there was a guard booth, and it was Ramadan while I was serving, and my guard would come out and set up his prayer rug and take a cup of water and perform his ablutions and pray in the yard and then get back to it. It was just a common part of his day, or seeing people just casually moving to and from the mosque wherever they are, um, hearing the not only the call to prayer but like bells in more Christian nations. Um, I Those are the places that you see actual interactions with religion, and I think they're if not benign, they're quite positive. Uh, but then you see the sort of fast food Hollywood movie version of religion that is a bit perverse, where you see vague and now more explicit American phrasing of this is a holy war against, X, Y, and Z, or even looking at Islamic State propaganda. That was a thing that I did as an intelligence analyst for a while. There's a joke in the intelligence community that the Islamic State had this, I mean, honestly, really well produced magazine called Davik. And I was talking with another analyst, and she was like, "Oh, well, like Davik has like a readership of basically 80% Islamic State and like 20% just intelligence analysts." And, and I'm like, I've read every issue; they're pretty good. But I was watching this one piece of Islamic State propaganda. It was a really well produced, and this was like, I guess must have been 2015 YouTube. Very well produced, really sort of crushing arguments against American infidels, but they had nothing to do with religion as much as they had a lot to do with speaking directly to the American soldier. They were saying specifically, like, look, your government doesn't care about you. Every 17 minutes, a former serviceman kills themselves. And that's because we have sort of infected the minds of the United States, and you're sort of spiritually deadened by the sort of your false holy war. Like that, I mean, those were really powerful messages. I remember showing it to my roommate. I'm like, this is a really, active and powerful message. And I think that it's possible to sort of create these meta religions that become an almost all encompassing philosophy. And it's something that we really have to guard against in the United States, right? Where you say one, you say something, you interact with some symbol, and then that indicates, a whole other raft of political beliefs. And that's simply not the case. So yeah, I see religion as a point of leverage and a catalyst towards action. But I find that the actual day-to-day practice of a faith does not at all comport with the violent action that it is leveraged to inspire. I mean, in terms of your experience, though, which I'm really curious about, is the chaplain corps, and also something that I had heard recently, and I don't know if you would have access to it, but I've heard that recently there was a dramatic reduction in the amount of possible religions somebody could express in the American Army or the larger military establishment. Is that true? And what does that necessarily portend?
Yeah, so that was announced. It was announced back in December from Hegseth. He's going to make the chaplain corps great again. That he was
Finally.
going to streamline faith codes. Yeah, because that was like the one thing all
That,
of us were
that was
so
the
worried
one
about.
thing. Yeah. I have been the biggest security threat I've been tracking is it's just that the chaplains got too woke.
Right. Well, and that's and what is wild about this is, and we can kind of, I'll stop and explain it a little bit, but the American military chaplain corps has largely always been white and Protestant Christian, but from the beginning, George Washington was very adamant that this was not a Christian religious military. That this was like, yeah, I want you to have a minister, a chaplain around for morals, for guidance. I think it'll
Right.
help with prostitution and alcoholism and stuff. But this isn't like
Help with stopping prostitution, right?
yeah, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
I was like,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I didn't realize that was a
Yes.
history of that. I didn't realize they were helping with prostitution.
But no. But
Fascinating history.
yeah. Well, and really in the last like a big hit to military chaplain corps and to the military at large was the Vietnam War and the 24-hour news cycle, and people did not like seeing war and how the state was legitimizing what was going on. And a lot of American Christian communities felt that even if they didn't become pacifists or were outright, they didn't like the idea of supporting war theology. And so, whether it was their own congregations and their own members, um, what that looked like over time was that people who would become, you know, ministers or chaplains, that war military chaplaincy was just not emphasized. They started going into prison or hospital or other institutions. But the evangelicals kept going. They kept going in the
Mm.
military, and they started wrapping in all this theology that you're talking about. These new versions, these new ideas, these networks that are not something that Jesus was walking around thinking about, when something that Martin Luther had even thought about, or Augustine, or like some of these things are like, this is a new story. And so,
Well,
anyway,
also leveraging something like I think I mean again, super not a biblical scholar in it in any respect, but leveraging the most abstract book of the Bible like Revelation and then saying, "Oh, and here's your evidence." Like it's scanty at best, but we also have to accept at face value that you're talking about a predictive document, and I don't think that the Bible claims to be a predictive document.
that, yes, that and prophecy, and then also going back to Bible as literature, it is an inconsistent document because it was written by numerous authors over time. You know what I mean? So to consider it a principled document on which you can build a constitution or a society's governance on, it's not consistently principled. I mean, even so, it's a whole thing. And um
Well,
I
there's
don't know
also
what the original question was. Sorry.
yeah, I think at this point I'm just sort of
We're
airing
just
my
chatting.
grievances with this too. But like okay, so here's one of the things that I think, from a strategic point of view, uh, God is not a good uh, not a great asset to have on your side, because God, as it turns out, can be on both sides at the same time. This is wild about religion, is that God can be on both sides, and so that's a problem from a strategic point of view. The other problem with from a strategic point of view is that if you are taking actions, you should consistently be listening to what the feedback actually is. And if you believe that no matter what happens, your God is going to see you through, well, then you're going to put your assets and your people into a much more dangerous situation. So that's another strategic problem with using God as the strategy. Hope is not a strategy, as they say. Faith is not a strategy, as they say. It also leads to just simply lazier thinking and to not treating your opponent with respect, with the respect that they are a dangerous and capable adversary. That's certainly something that we've seen in Iran recently, where we've worked ourselves into potentially one of the worst geopolitical positions that the United States chose to be in, specifically because we underestimated not only the military capabilities of our opponent, but their spiritual and philosophical underpinnings. Um, that's a too much belief in your own version of reality prevents you from generating a theory of mind for somebody else's, and that makes you a shitty general.
And also, you touched on the United States underestimating itself, and also how the U.S. has played a role in armed conflict and involving religion. Can you talk about how the United States, and I know these are different groups in the different parts of the same region. But can you talk about the Islamic State or the Taliban and how the United States played a role in either one of those groups, communities, growing in power, not growing in power? But how did the United States impact the Islamic State and Taliban?
So, in terms of, I know more about the Islamic State than I do the Taliban, so I'll speak more on them. I think that a common there's a common lack of after action planning. There's a common lack of foresight from the United States unfortunately, you can set your watch by. I don't know. I've never been in these planning cycles, so I don't know why we continually make this error, but the error looks similar throughout history. The error goes like, well, we believe that this society is antagonistic to our society, and that if left unchecked, it will eventually cross an ocean and delete our society. And you can go from containment of communism to the global war on terror, to whatever this thing in Iran is. The only motivator that we tend to have is existential threat, existential threat, existential threat. So it motivates us to go in, use an enormous amount of violent force, claim victory, and then leave. And it seems that that tends to create a good deal more problems in the very near future. So, with the case of the Taliban, obviously we were supporting the Northern Alliance and various groups of mujahideen against Russia in their war in Afghanistan. But after that case, we failed to do the hard work of helping with institution building afterwards. We left, and there was a bunch of strongmen who were more than happy to take power, and that's a huge problem. And I also do want to dispel this one, sort of conspiracy theory. And that's that the U.S. directly contributed to the creation of Al Qaeda in the area, and obviously there was a good deal of understanding that there were Arabic speakers operating in Afghanistan, but we didn't take them seriously enough as a threat, and because we essentially assumed they were a part of another network that was not going to be a threat to us. And so there's this overestimation of weaker powers and this underestimation of nascent powers that the United States consistently gets wrong. In terms of the Islamic State, I think this was more about creating the conditions that allowed that force to thrive. We disbanded the Ba'athist army. Nouri al-Maliki, a Shia, a representative of the Shia community who was quite close to Iran, had taken over the country. And on top of that, you had a bunch of disgraced people who were now surrounded on both sides by folks that they felt were existential threats. And not only that, but they're also trained militarily pretty darn well. So this is how you create the conditions to create an insurgent group. Now, notice at no point did I mention it was because of their specific, read of Islam. But I think it actually does bear mentioning that read of Islam, at least Wahhabist Islam, it comes from the need to leverage religion in order to expand a power base, right? So Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, he was an Islamic reformer. I want to say he was in 1700s. He was a pretty intense dude. Really, he was like, no, like, you guys are doing Islam all wrong. You have to be way more intense with it. This is like the no music, very intense against anything that might look polytheistic. And he was actually kicked out of the village that he was living in. At this point, Saudi Arabia was sort of a loose network of oasis towns. And at the same time, there's a guy named Ibn Abd al Saud who is living in another oasis town. And he's like, well, I want to sort of expand my power base, but I really have no religious precedent to do that because Muslims can't kill other Muslims. This is a big, part of our religion. We're not allowed to do that kind of thing. And so, as things tend to happen, he suddenly finds this holy man who's apparently quite well versed and well trained, and he's like gone to like the Harvard and Oxford of Islamic schools at this point. And suddenly, Saud had the religious precedent and the religious catalyst to say, well, now I can wage this sort of war of conquest. And that's because of leveraging religion in order to catalyze violent action. It's not necessarily the religion itself; it's who you are allowing to interpret that religion for you. And so it's like what you're talking about with the chaplain corps, where it's like as somebody who's grown up in a Christian framework, I can't recognize these ideas. Like I just don't recognize them despite having a deal of understanding of Christianity. And so because I can't recognize those ideas, because I don't see them appearing in the actual fundamental texts, then I'm exporting my understanding of what these spiritual instruments mean to a third party who clearly has ulterior motivations. I don't want Pete Hegseth to do my theological interpretations for me because I think he's wrong. And I think that the Protestant Reformation was really based on the fact that you do not need an interpretation layer between you and your spiritual life.
Oh, that was very beautifully said. You crushed that. Thank you um, for for sharing so much about how the religious rhetoric strategy is exploitative, and how, I mean, we could spend a whole other
Well, because
hour.
I mean, don't you just don't you just see that as the creation of a new type of, like, it's just creating a new government, right? It's just creating a new government that sucks, like that is operating off of poor ideas. Like the wonderful thing about the United States government is that you have inclusive accountability. You have the ability to say, hey, here's the information that we have, here's the decision that we took, here are the amount of people that wanted to take that decision, and here are what the effects are. That is a revolution in governance and political thinking. But the second that you shuttle decision making into the black box of because God said so, because that guy said that God said so, suddenly we end up in a really lame governance system, like one where the best ideas, by virtue of them being shut out of the decision making process, simply aren't sourced and surfaced and enacted, right?
Mhm, mhm. Well, and there's so many waves of it. I was reading recently how, coinciding over in the state of Israel was the chief rabbi of the IDF rabbinate, coinciding, like I said, with Netanyahu's rise in what, like right around 2009, 2010. There was a different tone of what it meant to be Jewish in the IDF, and
Yeah.
how they completely restructured within the military IDF of what it meant to be Jewish. Um, and it kind of shook them. Obviously, it shook a lot of things up, but it became very legalist. I mean, far more legalistic. You had a whole bunch of people breaking down. IDF is a conscripted army, so also like, most
Yeah.
people are going through this service, and now they, as soon as they're going into the military, they're being indoctrinated. So it's not. It's a mechanism that is really quite powerful to have a conscripted army that you are mandating what it looks like to be a certain type of theology within a umbrella. It begs a lot of questions about what is freedom, what is and how can we have freedom with religion, you know?
Well, and there's
But
there's I, there's something I wanted to bring up too about the Islamic State. So there was a report, and I wanted to pull up the exact one, but I can't find it. But anybody can look this up. I think there's some good research on this. But what was found out in sort of post hoc interviews with Islamic State fighters was that a significant percent of them, so I think it was something like only 20 to 30% of them knew the how to perform daily prayers. Like those were not practicing Muslims. Like they did not know how to do the most basic things in like Islamic practice. There's a wonderful report about that, which I can't find at the moment, but it's really, I mean, it's really telling. Now, of course, we have to bound some of this with the fact that, okay, well, potentially the community of people that were interviewed for this were, this is a self-selected community. Maybe these were the people that surrendered, and because they surrendered, they, lacked the religious zeal to make them fight harder. I don't know. But if we are saying that the community of Islamic State fighters was specifically motivated by a particular read of Islam, well, then it would stand to reason that anybody who's captured or surrendered would probably know how to do Islam, right? Um, and I think what you're saying with the IDF is really interesting because the military. I never served in the military, and certainly the Peace Corps is not is not as ideological an organization as the American military is. But having known folks that have gone through the military, I think this is an incredible apparatus of thought control, and it's an incredible apparatus of thought control because, frankly, it needs to be. That is how militaries have operated throughout history. But at the same time, when you connect that with religious, spiritual, and philosophical underpinnings, you do get something truly dangerous. Um, and potentially more dangerous than a traditional military. And it's not just dangerous because they can fight better because God's on their side, but it's dangerous because of what I mentioned earlier, that God is just a bad strategy. God leads you into making poor choices. Uh, yeah,
and that was one of the things that the chief rabbi that took over the IDF talked about was that uh, he wanted more people who were religious Zionists, and that if he wanted a strong army, he was going to have to convert them. I mean, he didn't say it himself, but he was like, "This secular Zionism is a serious issue for us. It's not enough just to have people say that they deserve homelands. Like we need to have them fully on board religiously." And I think about that, how funny that is that it's like, in order for us to colonize, and this is not shared just by the IDF. This is a very common thing, but it's
sure.
like how secular societies just don't typically go into colonialism. They don't have this like huge like, oh, we need to go and wage war and violence, and like there's this disenchantment. But also
Well,
you
I
could
I wonder. I'm curious about pushing back on this because this is really just me thinking out loud at this point. But I wonder if your assessment there is that secular societies don't generally like sort of like engage in conquest the same way. I wonder if this is a bit more like McDonald's peace theorem, which is this idea that like no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other. That was disproved. It was disproved in 2007 at the Russian invasion of South Ossetia. But it was a great idea while it lasted. And the reason that I sort of line these two up is like, is it the conditions or is it the cause, right? Is it the sort of geopolitical conditions which move a country to become a colonizing force, and then they adopt a sort of religious sentiment that allows that to continue. That was certainly the case with the creation of the modern state of Saudi Arabia. It's also in I've once heard the Bible described as like storytelling that largely talks about, potentially just the Old Testament anyway, it really talks about the move from humanity from hunter-gatherers to agrarian society. And you even see this in the story of Jacob and Esau. You have this and then you also have like the idea of people moving from this sort of like warrior bands to larger scaled communities. And one great way to make sure that your community and your ideology can scale is by making sure that people believe broadly the same thing. There's a moment where Muhammad comes back on to Mecca in after his he's sort of like he's left for Medina and then he's come back to Mecca. He's sort of waging his war of conquest. I hope this is right, so I'm totally gonna like look this up and cut it out if it's not correct. So my understanding is that at that point he re-enters the Kaaba, the big sort of black cube that we know from looking at videos of Mecca. He enters it, and at the time, since Mecca was a trading city, the Kaaba contained almost like effigies of each of the many religions that were around the area, and it basically said, your God is here, everybody's God is respected here, and you can all trade here, right? It allowed everybody to mostly be on the same network, if we're to use the network analogy. But then Muhammad enters the Kaaba and he apparently puts his staff down, and like all of these effigies explode, and it's like, there's one God now. And there's so much, especially in Islam, about this move to monotheism. There is only one God. And I've always been really curious about why that is so sort of front and center. I mean, this is a constant theological debate, right? It's between the Orthodox community and the Catholics. Are images of saints being worshipped, or are they just sort of like aspects of God? And when I think about it from a sort of strategic systems point of view, it's like having a single pointed religion allows you to enforce your strategic will a lot more efficiently, right? And so I think that in looking at your idea of like these wars of conquest, and oftentimes they're religiously motivated in some respect. My question is like, wouldn't they need to be? Like, wouldn't they have to have some sort of theological basis to unify and galvanize the action of so many disintermediated people? I think the only one that I can think of here that might be a good pushback against this might be like the like Alexander the Great's conquests, because he would just kind of be like, "Yo, you're a part of my empire now. Keep your religion, but like pay me." You know, from what I understand,
Okay.
I'm not a scholar of I'm not a scholar at all, but I'm pretty sure
Yes
he
and
said
no.
that exact thing.
I was right there, but no, I think that is a perfect point to sort of land on. Is and in no way, shape, or form am I trying to say that secular societies immediately bring peace, obviously, and I know that like, but
Well,
that's not what I'm saying.
Oh
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I also sorry, just because a secular society and peace. So I'm also uniquely situated to talk about this briefly. But I live in Albania, and Albania was the first atheist state for 50 years, and peaceful it was not. So under the reign of Enver Hoxha, it was an isolationist like super hardcore communist country that outlawed religion. It did no conquesting. I will say that. But man, it wasn't a peaceful place, and I think that ultimately comes down to and it's like such an annoying political philosophy 101 question of like, what is a religion? Can a state be a religion? And yeah, I'm super not prepared to delve into that, but it's like the difference between art and pornography, like when you see it, I
Right.
guess.
Right. Right. Well, and no, no, absolutely. Secularism does not mean peace. But on the flip side, religionizing a country or theocratizing a country does enhance motivation to sacrifice for.
Damn. Yeah. There's an interesting thing that I'm like, it's been in my head for the last little bit because I wrote a podcast episode about this the other day. It was about how like how grain basically becoming an agrarian society ends up forming the foundations of the state in the first place. And then there's this quote by Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek, I guess, economist that wrote Techno Feudalism. And he talks about how power is ultimately about capturing surplus. That, like, if you're in an early agrarian society, whoever has the surplus, like whoever has basically the keys to the grain and can distribute it and can, X, Y, and Z, they're the king, right? There's even the hydrologic statecraft theory by Wittfogel, I think, who basically says like, look, if there's ever this large hydrological project that needs, that takes that's difficult to bring water to people, they'll end up with a centralized power, because the centralized power is the only thing that's going to allow people to like get water, the fundamental thing that they need, right? And so I'm thinking about that concept of capturing the surplus, and I haven't drawn a good line around it just yet, but it's something I've been, chewing on for a little bit, and I'm wondering what it means to capture the surplus of belief, or capture the surplus of an agency or attention. Like, is it possible that now we're sort of moving into this point in history where the surplus is like our additional agency, or our attention, or even the uh like the sort of philosophical underpinnings that we need to sort of feel sane in a time that feels very disjointed. Yeah, I mean, I think people, there's a very clear crisis of meaning that comes from not only a lot of the technological factors that we're dealing with right now, but uh, the fact that we don't really, feel a grand sense of agency as maybe like we've heard people felt before. And because of that, it hands over power to people who say, I know what's going on. And maybe that's the surplus that they're capturing. I don't know.
Could be surplus like knowledge. I know a phrase that like kind of you talk about capturing the surplus is how power is accumulated. A phrase that came up for me in my studies in theology and political history was the idea of the Protestant Reformation now creating a sort of environment called the free market of believers. And I hadn't
Yeah.
heard free market of believers
Yeah. How
as like a
cool.
sort of economic term to describe what happened with marketing and trying to attract people into the churches. And it's
Well, and
uh
this was exactly why the Jesuits, I can't,
right.
educated by them. The Jesuits were created. So the Jesuits were created as a response to the Protestant Reformation. And basically, like, they were supposed to be like, these like learned Navy SEALs that were gonna go like Bible jujitsu the hell out of anybody who like picked up one of Martin Luther's pamphlets or like started try and read a Bible in their own language, and they just like karate chop them out of their hands and be like, man, well, I'm gonna own you with logic and reason because I'm a Jesuit.
Yeah.
Like, that's why it was created to like to recapture this free market of religious ideology.
Well, Eric, this has been a fantastic conversation. I mean, I hate to stop it now, but I've got
I'll
a
come back
work here in a
anytime.
little
This is
bit.
great.
Please
Yeah,
do.
any old
Yeah,
time.
absolutely. Can you tell folks who have listened to us today, how can they learn more about you, follow you, etc.?
Yeah, go obviously, so you can follow me on TikTok at the under report. It has underscores between the and under and report. So you can find me there. You can listen to my podcast, also called the Under Report. The podcast is really more deep dive storytelling on a lot of these concepts. So this whole thing about grain and capturing the surplus, we just did that episode last week, and I'm so proud of the title. It's called Grain of Thrones. I felt my producer was like, very good. I was like, thank you. Anyway, so there's that. I do a weekly intelligence brief. So I do the sort of 5 stories that nobody's covering. The best way to support me is to do the paid version of that. And for a limited time, I'll also send you a copy of my book, You're Not Here, Travels Through Countries That Don't Exist, if you subscribe to that. And yeah, I think, and Instagram, TikTok, it's all the same. I put, and YouTube. So, and
Well,
reach out anytime. I've met such great people through, obviously, like, this has been an incredible conversation.
yeah, absolutely. Eric Czuleger, folks, what a treat. What a treat. You will definitely come back. We'll have lots of conversations. I
Hell
feel
yeah.
like we just sort of like high-fived a bunch of bullet points. But like
Yeah.
you said, yeah, we can make a podcast series out of any one of our questions today. And folks, if you've listened to this, please let me know what you think in the comments. It has been such a delight having you today, Eric, and I really want to know my followers. What did you guys think? Did y'all learn a bit? This was we're very fortunate for all your experience, and wow, Eric, thank you.
Also, do fact check all of those things. I'm pretty sure I'm on there, but yeah, if I said anything that was nonsensical about especially about the religions that you are, do let me know directly. I'm always trying to learn and make sure that I'm saying things that are accurate.
Amen. I feel like I should do that too. Just like have an asterisk. Be like, I'm trying my best. My
I'm Yeah. I did a whiteboard explaining the difference between Sunni and Shia the other day, and I was like, "Wow, this is complex."
Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Oh my goodness. Well, Eric, thank you. And folks, don't forget, like I said, let me know what you thought down in the comments, and don't forget to like, follow, subscribe. You know the drill. This has been another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson, and until next time, see ya.
Bye.